Hi, victimology students. I miss having you all in class, and typically I'd be starting off with a Mentimeter, as you know, but we're going to start covering human trafficking again. This is not going to be a super exciting topic because it's by nature depressing, but it is really interesting. So please follow along if you're using this to your benefit, which I hope you are. So go to the resources. Again, you cannot ignore the potential help that the counseling services here can provide. You can also go to the police if you suspect anybody is being a victim of human trafficking. And then I've also included the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is operated by the Polaris Project. And the Polaris Project is one amazing resource I'm going to be using throughout this presentation. There's also the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which often deals with children who've been exploited for sexual purposes. So very, very upsetting. Let's move into what human trafficking is, though. And I typically would probably have asked you this question, right? I would have said, what do you personally think human trafficking is? What does it look like to you? And I'm going to give you official definitions, but I do want you to know there's different types. Essentially, though, it is equated with modern day slavery. So people are being forced or coerced into different types of involuntary work, whether that's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and we'll differentiate between those shortly. According to the Polaris Project, though, it's considered the business or process of stealing freedom. So people think slavery ended in 1865, but unfortunately, it's still very real. And it wasn't a federal crime in the United States, which is crazy, until 2000. So we're going to talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And there's also domestic versus transnational human trafficking. So if it's domestic, it's occurring in our country or the country of origin where they're talking about the issue. But if it's transnational, they are traveling between borders. So we're going to look at facts and figures next. And there's a lot of differentiation here because I have some different sources. So I have the victimology textbook I always talk to y'all about. I have the Polaris Project, and I also have this amazing book if any of you are interested in just having something good to read about human trafficking. So it's called Slaves Among Us, The Hidden World of Human Trafficking. It's written by Monique Villa, and she's an activist in this area. So there's different statistical evidence on each of these, and I don't know which one is the most accurate. We can't possibly know. The textbook, Daigle and Muftick, claim that there are 12 million people who are victims annually of human trafficking. According to the Polaris Project, that number is actually 28 million, and in Slaves Among Us, they claim there's at least 40 million victims with at least 5 million traffickers. So again, we're not entirely sure. We'll talk about why it goes undetected. But according to the Polaris Project, there are 5 most common types of trafficking in the United States. And the first one is escort services. So if you don't know what that is, it's typically, it can be free will, where somebody decides they want to be an escort. Typically, you're going to be dealing with high-end clients who make a lot of money, and it's still usually prostitution because in many cases, they're going to be at least going on dates, if not engaging in sexual intercourse for money. Pornography is the second one. So while pornography can be consensual and somebody can opt into it, in this case, it'd be somebody being forced into sexual acts that are then recorded and produced for pornographic profit. There's illicit massage, health, and beauty parlors, and I'm sure you can imagine what that is. There's also residential-based commercial sex, and so this can look a lot like somebody keeping somebody there with them and using them amongst their friends sexually, or even potentially having them service different neighborhoods. But we also know that personal sex servitude is the last one out of the most common. So the 5 most common types, which would be like what you might have seen in the Criminal Minds episode once or twice. I'm sure you might have seen that, where somebody keeps somebody kind of a slave and uses them for their own sexual gratification. When we look at recruiter types, it's really sad. Actually, a family member or caregiver is the most common mechanism for recruiting somebody into this work, followed by their intimate partner, which we'll see some cases today that deal with that, and then also their employer, or I should say the proposed employer, because they're often tricked into this. Continuing on to slide 6, the data that I have there is from the most recent compilation of hotline calls to that hotline I referenced earlier with the Polaris Project. They had over 10,000 substantiated crisis calls in 2021 alone in the US, and they identified and saved 16,554 victims from those calls alone. Regarding the immigration status, 3% were American, the rest were foreign national. Well, 73% were foreign national, and then 25% they aren't sure what their origin was. Most of them were recruited in different mechanisms. So 65% were via the internet. And you can imagine how that might happen. One thing I found interesting is that among those who recruited their victims on the internet, 13% of those cases were done in the premise of online dating sites. 24% were from another location. 5% were recruited from school. 2% from group and foster care, and 4% from a correctional detention facility. So very, very creepy. There are various types of trafficking. I've already mentioned them. So sex trafficking, as defined by the Polaris Project, is the crime of using force, fraud, or coercion to induce another individual to sell sex. And you might see some common types of sex trafficking as escort services, pornography, those massage businesses, brothels, etc. Labor trafficking, which is actually more common but less talked about, is the crime of using force, fraud, or coercion to induce another individual to work or provide service. You might see this with agricultural work, which is pretty common in the US, or people who are forced to work in the fields. Domestic work, so maybe being somebody's personal cleaner, etc., but basically they're a slave. Cleaning services, and even carnivals, which I found very strange. As far as sex trafficking goes, there's different ways people get trapped into this, and I'm going to read some of them. And this is coming from, again, the Polaris Project, which is a fantastic resource. So the first one, which I always think of, is they call them Romeo pimps or boyfriending. These men will appear as, really charismatic and charming and kind of like a knight in shining armor, but they're going to eventually lift that facade and force them into sex work. It could be sex work with their friends. It could be sex work with men on the street, etc. We'll talk about that. And they will use violence to keep her in line. Family trafficking or familial trafficking can be really, really sad. I can't even imagine. But the example they give is when a mom has been groomed that way and was a prostitute growing up, she might foresee that as the only way in which she and her child can make money, and then force her child into engaging in sexual behaviors. And they talk about different ways this could end. And so in this case, it might be a teacher who recognizes the child is exhibiting certain signs. There's also child trafficking, which is when the parent sexually abuses the child themselves and or offers them to others in exchange for abusing their children. So kind of like we talked about Eileen Wuornos and how her grandpa was doing that. It's very, very sad. If it is caught, which I hope it always is, and it never happens in the first place, an ER doctor might be the one who notices the signs of sexual trauma. Online trawling, they call it, is typically seen when somebody's promised that they'll have a modeling opportunity and they'll go to meet the person. They've, talked them up and said they're beautiful and they could be a really great model. And then when they get there, they're tricked into sex trafficking. Survival sex could be for a runaway teen. An example they give is a teen who identifies as queer runs away because his father or stepfather beats him up for his identity. And then he eventually meets other runaways who tell them about a person who let them stay with them. But the problem is the price of staying with them is sexual activities. So again, taking advantage of and exploiting individuals. People also exploit those who are addicted to drugs. They might give them drugs for free and then tell them they owe them money, and that's the way they can earn it back. With people who have disabilities, especially if they're not at home but they're in a group living facility, they might be told that sex with strangers is normal. And imagine if they have a cognitive disability, they may not really understand that. And so that's really sad as well. Gangs might also force people into prostitution to make money for the gang. And the way they can keep them in is they threaten them that they will engage in violence against them or their loved ones if they do not comply. There's also CEO pimping, and this is when somebody at her job might meet a man who promises her all these tales of rich and fame, and um, she doesn't really do what she's supposed to. So example they gave was a strip club, but she's not making enough money, and he says it's because she's not actually engaging in sexual activities. And if he doesn't do that, or sorry, if she doesn't, he promises that he'll blackmail her and threaten to hurt her child. So again, these are very realistic examples. Let's move into labor trafficking examples. So one of them's the first one's migrants, immigrants, and domestic work. So a diplomat entices someone, and a diplomat is somebody who's pretty high up from her home country to come to the U.S. and care for their children. But once they get there, they sleep in a closet. They don't give them basic care. They take away all of her identification so she can't go to ICE or anywhere else. And that if she does try to go anywhere, they'll report her to ICE. Domestic work and marriage. So this is interesting. The wife might be, this is just an example, forced to keep or take care of his children from another relationship, keep the house, work in the family business, and not leave the house. She has no money and doesn't speak the language. Her husband tells her complaining will bring shame on the family and ruin her sister's chances of a good marriage. So there's a lot of options that would be really sad there. And exploitation of disabilities again. They might promise safety to somebody for helping around the house, but they actually are overworked in their family business. Addiction is kind of the same thing. They might not get pay, etc., and they can kind of hold their sobriety over their head or lack thereof. And then fraudulent job offers. This is very, very common. This is where somebody will promise somebody overseas a really amazing job opportunity in the U.S., and then once they get there, they'll take away all of their identifications. They can't leave, and they will abuse them. There's also recruitment fees and debt bondage, which is a big one. Debt bondage is a name you should know. It's also in the textbook. Basically, they might say, like, this is going to be free. You can come from Mexico to the U.S. I'll give you a temporary visa, etc. But they're told it costs $5,000 for the visa. So they borrow money from the employer and get there, and they have to work it off. They might have to keep working it off because there was no such promise to begin with, right? So it was all a facade. All right, so moving on to slide 10, this is a case study. This is from this book, which is fantastic. And this is really sad. This is Jennifer Kempton's story. We also in this book hear from Salem, is that his name? Yeah, Salem, her boyfriend Salem, who sex trafficked her. We hear from his previous wife, who was also trapped for a little while into sex trafficking, but luckily managed to escape. So Jennifer met him and was infatuated. He was so good to her. She'd been using drugs, but nothing super serious or addictive, but he got her hooked on more addictive drugs like heroin. And he kind of got her dope sick and her without any of the drugs she needed to maintain her high. And then he eventually, as a punishment, and then eventually he would put her on Craigslist, and he said, like, you can model and we'll take pictures. And then it became more and more in tune, I guess, in relation with sexual activities. And then he told her she had to go meet people for sex and get paid because she owed him money. And one time she was detailing her story in the case, and it was really sad. She met up with these guys. She got in the wrong car, and they took her to a hotel, and she doesn't remember anything. She woke up without clothes and was getting raped by 3 guys. When she came back to tell her boyfriend what happened, thinking he would help her, he just abused her and threatened her some more. She did escape, and she did speak at one of the human rights campaigns with VIA, but she died, unfortunately, in 2019 from a suspected drug overdose. All right, this is really sad. The extent of human trafficking is largely unknown. It doesn't really get detected easily. It's an underground crime. It's hidden. You wouldn't necessarily know how to look for it. But I will post a video of an amazing flight attendant named Sheila Fredericks who saved a woman's life because she recognized the signs. There's also a lack of reporting. And even if you do try to report it, sometimes depending on where you're at, you might encounter corrupt police officers who are part of the trade anyway. So what are you going to do? It's also mobile, or it moves a lot. So people aren't going to stay in the same location very long. So again, they talk about the trafficking in persons report in the U.S. According to this data, there's 12.3 million individuals who are victims each year. and 2 million of them are children. They have a reporting system via the Department of Justice. This is where we get this estimate that for every one person forced into sex trafficking or prostitution, there are 9 forced into labor trafficking. All right, very, very sad. People don't usually think of that when you think of trafficking. You usually think of sex trafficking. Okay, more females than males are forced into sex trafficking, but more males are commonly forced into labor trafficking. There's also source countries where people will pull or recruit people to be victims of sex trafficking or labor trafficking from, and destination countries, so the countries where people are bringing them to. So the number one source country is Russia. Most victims are pulled from Russia. And the 2 most common destination countries are Germany and, unfortunately, the United States. So just know that. For risk factors, extreme poverty could push somebody into accepting a job offer or feeling like they have this amazing opportunity that they have to pursue in another country, and then they're tricked into trafficking. Country risk factors, so if it's a country that has a lot of civil unrest, like they're going through war, or they have corrupt officials like Bosnia and Herzegovina, they are not going to be very helpful. And then depending on how they treat women in their country in the first place, we might find it difficult to see any help there. Please read through the consequences of human trafficking and watch Rebecca's story. It's very sad. I just want to give you a preface there. And she does talk about some of the really sad effects that had on her children too, or child. You should know the consequences of human trafficking. It's been equated to the same lifelong process as recovering from a drug addiction because the trauma is so real. There's also responses. So the UN has the Palermo Protocol, and it's based on suppressing, and punishing traffickers. But only in 2017, only 39 countries were rated as Tier 1 with full compliance. So that's very sad. In the US, we have the T visa. This is given out to victims of human trafficking for 3 years. They can remain as a temporary resident, and they can apply for permanent residency after that. From what I've seen, there's not a lot of people who receive that, though, so that's kind of tricky. The FBI is fantastic, as you know. Maybe when you talk to the FBI agent and the victim specialist on the 27th, they can answer questions about this. But they work with over 100 human trafficking task force to detect, apprehend, and punish traffickers while also offering victims the counseling services they need. There's also the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015. And I know I just saw one. I hope I'm not misrepresenting which one it is. Nope. Okay. So any non-indigent entity, so any person who is convicted of human trafficking who can pay, they are forced to pay $5,000 for an assessment, and it goes to the Domestic Trafficking Victims Fund. So their money is going right back to the victims, which I love. There's also healthcare screening. So if you go to any hospital or doctor's office, you'll likely see when you close the restroom door, there will be signs advocating for detection of human trafficking victims, and they'll provide resources there. They'll also tell you to tell your doctor. And sometimes if you are isolated from the trafficker and you're there by yourself, you'll be asked questions like, do you feel safe at home? So the healthcare industry is really, really helpful in detecting this as well. Lastly, North Carolina has its own response. So I don't know if you knew this or not, but we are in one of the top 10 states in the U.S. for human trafficking. And so Senate Bill 626 was just signed into law on June 30th, 2023. What does it do? Well, it offers victims of human trafficking a lifelong or permanent order of protection against their trafficker. I'll give you some more information soon about your case studies and the podcast episode, but I hope you all are doing well and you have a great day. Bye.